Welcome to the Multidimensional Evolution Podcast. I am your host, Kim McCall. If you want to find out more about life beyond the physical dimension, this is the place to be. We will be having conversations to expand your consciousness and help you reconnect with your essential self. But given the subject matter's a request, don't believe in anything, including what is shared here. Experiment, have your own experiences, and always use discernment. Welcome to episode 4, where we're talking everything out-of-body travel. My guest today is Bob Peterson, a prolific out-of-body explorer and author of books such as Out-of-Body Experiences, How to Have Them and What to Expect, Lessons Out of the Body, a Journal of Spiritual Growth and Out-of-Body Travel, Answers Within, How to Use Your Inner Voice for Wisdom, Spirituality and Psychic Awareness, and his most recent, published earlier this year, Hacking the Out-of-Body Experience, Leveraging Science to Induce OBEs. As well as being an OBE explorer, Bob is a really scientific guy. He's a computer analyst, and he brings critical, analytical skills to his own experiences and to the whole OBE phenomena. So if you're into this topic, it's a must listen. We will cover his vast, extensive knowledge about the OBE literature, what he thinks happens when we leave the body, the kind of things that we can experience as we are leaving, the kind of sensations that sometimes might put us off and why they're normal, and finally, what it all means. What's the point? Why should we leave the body? I really hope you enjoy this episode. Hey, Bob, welcome to the Multidimensional Evolution Podcast. It is lovely to have you on today.
Hi, Kim. Great to be here.
We're going to talk everything out-of-body experience today, and definitely want to dive into your book, Hacking the Out-of-Body Experience. But to start with, maybe we could just make sure listeners know what we're talking about, and if you could tell us a bit about the different definitions or how you use it, the words out-of-body experience, dreaming, and lucid dreaming, and how they relate to each other.
Okay, yeah. Well, as I see it, most out-of-body experiencers who've gone into this in any depth agree that we leave our bodies, or we have an out-of-body experience, or a dissociative experience every night. And it's just that we don't remember it, right? We're not conscious, so we don't remember it. But I tend to break down those dissociative experiences into 4 categories, basically, depending on whether or not you're conscious and whether or not you're hallucinating. Because the way I see it, when you're, if you're unconscious and you're hallucinating, it's a self-created hallucination. I call that a regular dream. Okay, so dreams I would consider kind of a form of out-of-body experience, but you have no idea that you're, in an out-of-body experience, and you're completely absorbed in this self-created hallucination that we call a dream. Sorry,
I was just curious when you said you're unconscious and hallucinating.
Yeah.
Because when I think of unconscious, like there's nothing there, but I'm passed out sort of thing. But you're saying you're unconscious and hallucinating. So could you just unpick that distinction a little bit?
Well, I mean, what I mean to say is that you don't have lucidity. You don't have your full waking conscious awareness with you.
Yeah.
So it's not that you're completely out like a light bulb is out. It's just that it's not a conscious experience. It's an unconscious. It's not a self-aware state.
It's like happening to you.
Yeah. And then so if you gain lucidity and you gain conscious awareness in that state, that's a lucid dream, right? So you're conscious and awake and aware, and you realize fully that you're in this experience. You realize you're dreaming, and you're conscious, and you know what's going on, and it's just like your waking awareness, but you're still trapped inside that hallucination of the dream. And so you're still in this dream world, and that's a lucid dream. And And then on the other side of the equation, if you dispel the hallucination and you remain conscious, then it's an out-of-body experience. So I define an out-of-body experience as an experience in which you seem to have 100% of your conscious awareness outside your physical body. In other words, your physical body is just another inanimate object in the room. And then, of course, there's a fourth quadrant too, and that is if you're unconscious and you don't have that conscious waking awareness, but you're outside of that hallucination, then that's what they call a shared dream. And that is where, multiple people can be inside and inside the, in a dreaming state, and they describe the same physical, they're two people, they're standing at the Golden Gate Bridge, they both see a dolphin jump in the water or something like that, and they both describe the same thing in the morning, but they were clearly not conscious and aware that it was happening at the time, but they both described that strange same dream. That's what I would call a shared dream, and there are some reports of that, although it's not real common in literature. So anyway, I've got kind of a four-quadrant diagram that I use to map that out, and depending on your awareness and all of that. And that's what I define as an out-of-body experience. It's a conscious experience, yes. And you don't seem to be hallucinating at all. It seems to be that you're experiencing some kind of other reality, some other form of reality. I'm not saying that it has any relationship with our current physical reality, although there's some evidence to suggest it does and some to suggest it doesn't. But it does seem to be more stable and not a hallucination. In a lucid dream, you can dispel the hallucination and find yourself out of body. And then once you see the difference between the two, you can tell that, oh yeah, this is only a hallucination and I'm not hallucinating anymore. So just as you realize right now that you're not dreaming, you would realize in an out-of-body state that you're not dreaming as well.
And I think you touched there on something that in your book, Hacking the Out-of-Body Experience, you emphasize it at a few spots that we can transition from a lucid dream into an out-of-body state by becoming aware of the hallucination, as you say.
Yeah, and that's probably the easiest way to induce an out-of-body experience is through the lucid dreaming state. There are a lot of books out there on how to lucid dream, and a lot of little tips and techniques that, little things like questioning your reality all the time and all of that, and doing reality checks and reminders. Ask yourself, am I dreaming, that kind of thing throughout the day. And then you find that your daytime habits carry into your nighttime habits, and you end up at some point asking yourself in a dream, am I dreaming? And then you realize, yes, in fact, I am dreaming, and I know this is a dream. And then, for example, I've had many lucid dreams. I don't consider myself real good at lucid dreaming because I've had a lot more out of bodies than lucid dreams. But with lucid dreaming, you realize that you're dreaming or whatever, and then with a conscious act of will, you basically tell yourself to wake up from that hallucination, and that hallucination, just that whole dream world that you were in, just dissolves and into nothingness, and you find yourself usually floating above your physical body and in your bedroom and all of that.
Now, today you are a prolific author. On this topic, you've written a number of books on this topic. You're a blogger. You are very active in the space of, if people don't know, on Facebook, there are quite a number of groups that deal with out-of-body travel, astral projection, and you'll quite often find Bob contributing, commenting, answering recurring questions. But obviously it wasn't always like that. At some point this all started for you. And could you just give people a bit of a sense of how did you get into this? Because this is not a very common thing for people to get into.
Yeah, I never really expected to get into this topic myself. It all goes back to 1979, and I had just graduated from high school and was starting. Just starting college, basically. And my brother Joe knew that my dad had an interest in like Edgar Cayce and some other things like that. And so Joe gave my dad a book, the book Journeys Out of the Body by Robert Monroe. And Robert Monroe ended up starting the Monroe Institute and exploring all kinds of states of consciousness. But anyway, when my dad was done reading the book, I asked him if I could borrow it because I was intrigued, and I had kind of remembered, in my childhood, somebody mentioning astral projection, and I thought, oh, this is kind of intriguing. I want to know more about it. So I read this book, and I was a very scientific, skeptical kind of guy at the time, and I still really am. I still am very science-minded. But Robert Monroe didn't say to take him at his word. He had all of these outlandish stories about, traveling in his spirit body to different locations and this and that. And as outlandish as they were, he said, don't take my word for it, try it yourself. And in his book, he gives a technique, the lines of force technique, which I give in the new book.
Yes.
And the he basically, it's a way of slowing down your mind and basically doing some visualizations and such. And I thought, any good scientist, doesn't dismiss things out of hand. You have to keep an open mind to be a good scientist. And so I thought, well, I'll give him the benefit of the doubt and try it myself. And much to my great surprise, I got immediate results. And what happened is I followed Monroe's directions to the letter. And I probably was at this for more than an hour, trying to get my mind completely still and get my body completely relaxed and all of that. And I was visualizing these lines of force, and all of a sudden I felt kind of a twang in my head. And it's like, oh, and it startled me. It's like, what's that? What just happened to me? That something's not right. And so I immediately tried to work my way back to physical conscious awareness again, back to my physical body. But it seemed to me that these lines of force I had been imagining had become real somehow. And it pulled this energy into my body, which is very strange sounding to any normal sane person. But then these electrical vibrations swept into my body, and I quite literally felt like I was being electrocuted. And it sounds very scary and shocking, and it was very scary and shocking. So it felt like my entire body was being electrocuted, and I started wildly thrashing, trying to regain control of my body. But what I found was that my physical body was completely paralyzed. I had gone into sleep paralysis. So I couldn't move my body. And then I really panicked, and I lost it and started thrashing wildly. And I eventually regained control of my physical body. And I was just completely blown away by the depth of the reality of it. I mean, how real it felt, and how just how palpable it was. It was a very intense experience. This wasn't something that you're imagining or whatever. It was, it felt very, very real and scary at the time. Now, for anyone who's out there who has aspirations of doing this themselves, I should also mention that the vibrations are something that smooth out and get more better over time. And subsequently, each time I had an out-of-body experience, they seemed to get smoother and smoother. And after so many years, I didn't really even feel them anymore. I barely feel them at all. And in fact, to some people, the vibrations can be quite pleasurable. Author Nancy Trivolato of the IAC has a book on the vibrations. The entire book is about the vibrations, and it's a very big book. And she describes the vibrations as being similar to orgasm, being very pleasurable and something that's desirable. So it's not always scary. But so anyway, once sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you, but I was just going to continue that. Once I had experienced the vibrations, I didn't really leave my body that time, but I was hooked, because now as a scientist, I felt like I had touched on something that was unknown to the world of science, and I felt obligated to explore it further. And having read books like Monroe's, I knew that I couldn't believe what other people wrote about it unless I experienced it myself, right? Because, experience trumps belief and it trumps faith. And
Absolutely.
so I figured, there's probably a lot of misinformation floating around and everything. And so I started collecting books on the subject. I started reading them all voraciously. I started trying to practice all the different techniques and all the different books. And Monroe's technique didn't work for me a second time, unfortunately, but I started learning other techniques and finally developed my own. And so that's where I came from. It's still a very intriguing topic to me. It always has been. It always will be. And it's a very real experience that is reported throughout time and in every culture, regardless of religions and belief systems and everything else. So it's a universal phenomenon.
Yes, absolutely. And that really, as an anthropologist myself, that universal aspect of it across cultures has always really fascinated me and appealed to me. And look, there's so much in what you just shared. The electricity, those sensations are so powerful, and as you say, they can be scary. And I do want to come back to those later. And the Monroe book you mentioned, I think that's a real classic in the out-of-body literature. Yeah. And I wonder whether it helped you. I only came across that book quite late in my own sort of studies around this topic. But he talks about how he himself went through this process of thinking he was going crazy and even going to the extent of seeing a psychiatrist to have himself evaluated because he wanted to make sure that these experiences didn't reflect on his sanity in some way. And I guess, was that somehow comforting for you to have someone else who'd taken that path, so you at least knew that what you were experiencing was something to expect and not something to be too scared about?
Yeah, absolutely. It helped that Monroe had written that book. And I read a whole bunch of different books after that point. Of course, that was back in 1979, so there weren't a lot of books on the subject. There was Sylvan Muldoon had written some books on the subject, some of which were very hard to find. And then a Frenchman who went under the pen name Eram, and Oliver Fox was another guy who wrote under a pen name. And so anyway, there were just a few books on the subject at the time. And I read these, and to me, it kind of struck me that some of these people were coming at it. I don't know. It seemed like they had a whole bunch of superstitions, and what they wrote about didn't always match what I had experienced. And for example, some of these books that are out there, they say that, all you have to do to manifest something is to think about it or whatever, or all you have to do to travel to a location is think about it. Yeah. Well, I would do experiments where I would, think about my friend Lisa or somebody, and I wouldn't go anywhere. And I had all these problems with my eyesight, and that really wasn't touched upon really much, except Sylvan Muldoon did talk about it a little bit. But as I got more and more experience, what I found is that there were a whole bunch of things that I considered misinformation, and maybe superstition is even a better word. Things that people thought about the experience that didn't make sense to me. And I thought it was probably my duty as kind of a contributor of science or whatever, to share with the world, everything that I had found out about, things like the eyesight in the out of body state, and what touch perception is like there, and all of these different things that I had encountered. What are your encounters with people like, and animals, and how does your
yes.
How does your mind work? Emotional versus analytical, those kind of things that aren't really talked about in other books. And I kind of thought it was my duty to report these things. And so what I did is I wrote this book, my first book, Out of Body Experiences, How to Have Them and What to Expect. And it was published in 1997. I wrote it I gave it to my publisher in 1995. And it was a collection of different experiences and what I had found out about them. And and I put it on my website in 1995. So I put it on my website for free 2 years before it was actually available in print, just to prove that I'm not in it for the money. So it's like, I want to share this information with the world. And I even asked my publisher, gee, would it be okay for me to put this on my website? And they didn't even balk. They just kind of, they were pretty open-minded at the time, and they said, well, it's you own the copyright to it, so it's your decision to do something like that. But
that's great.
They're obviously trying to make money at it, and so anyway, what I found is that by putting it on my website, I made the information available all over the world. So it wasn't just a book in the United States. I had people in Africa reading my book, and sending me emails and stuff. And that to me was very rewarding, because I felt like I was helping people. And that to me is the reward for it.
Yeah. And that really comes across in your whole approach to this subject matter. A researcher trying to make information available to anybody who's trying to explore this. And so one of the things that I've really appreciated, and I feel people should know, because is your book reviews. Because if today, as you said, in the 70s, there weren't many books about it. Today, if you want to look at this topic, you can be overwhelmed by the amount of books that you can find. And so if you are listening to this and you want to find out more about out-of-body travel, Bob has taken a lot of work off your hand by reading many, many books and put reviews online for you to look at. And there's going to be a link to his reviews in the information next to this show. But I suppose I'd be curious if you could just give us briefly a bit of a summary when you're reading books on OBEs, the kind of things that you're looking for, whether there's any alarm bells that you have, or any kind of measures that you have as to whether something seems authentic or not. Because as we've talked about, there is a whole vast sort of information that some of it maybe is misinformation or misunderstandings. And also just a sense of sort of commonalities that you've come across in reading all these books.
Yeah, well, there's a great variety of different out-of-body books out there. I've amassed a collection of well more than 200 books on it, probably up to 250 books on it now. And that's just books on out-of-body experience. That doesn't, and astral projection. That does not include peripheral topics like near-death experiences, or lucid dreaming, or altered states of consciousness, or remote viewing, or any of that. That's just out-of-body books. And what I found is, in the more recent years, and like in the last 10 years, there's been almost an exponential growth in the number of OBE books out there. But usually, just reading the book, you can tell whether or not the book that the author is coming from a place of experience or not, just by the way they describe things. Sometimes, like one of my favorite examples is one of the books that I read. He described out-of-body experiences as having I forget how he worded it. He said something like a delicious eeriness, that it was kind of a delicious eeriness to the experience. And I thought, this guy really gets it. He's been there, because nobody who, unless you've actually had an out-of-body experience, you wouldn't come to think of those words to describe an experience. So I look for things like that. There's a lot of books out there that just try and teach the techniques that basically, I think there's a lot of authors that are out there that are just trying to, maybe they've had out-of-body experiences since they were really young, and they don't know how to do it themselves, but they describe some of their experiences, and then they say, oh, this is, how to do it, or whatever. And part of it, I don't know, it's hard to describe, but you can tell authentic experiences from unauthentic ones, or inauthentic. I prefer books that have narratives, OBE narratives, where they talk about their experiences. And one of the reasons that Robert Monroe's first book really resonated with me is that he described both his experiences and his, process of astonishment of, how is this happening? And, do I need to see a psychiatrist, or do I need to consult with a doctor? I mean, he was a somewhat he was a business executive. He had started his own businesses and stuff, and so he had a little bit of money squirreled away, and so he knew people in, he knew professional doctors and psychiatrists and stuff. So he'd go to his buddies and he'd say, give me your honest opinion about this stuff. And I really appreciate books that come at it from that degree of honesty and upfrontness about it, that, no, you're not going crazy. This is really what's happening. And I really don't like, some of these books come out as saying, oh, I'm the expert, I'm the master, and you're the student. And, through my years of mastery, I've got all this, these special secret techniques or whatever. Come on, this is, we're all just students. We're all just learning, and we're all sharing, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm really turned off by arrogance. I think a lot of authors can get arrogant about their experiences and what where they've taken them. And I think a lot of the thing is transcending your own ego just to get there in the first place.
Mm.
So.
Yeah. And I guess that leads me then to your most recent book, because my sense is that that's really a drawing on both your own experiences, but also your many years of studying the topic. So if you'd like to say a little bit about, what you put into that, and maybe, because really it's practical, right? And it's a practical how-to manual. You want to have an out-of-body experience, read Hacking the Out-of-Body Experience, and you'll find all the different tools. And I have to say, in reading it, I really appreciated how accessible it is. The language is very accessible. It's very easy to read. Chapters are nice and succinct, so you have a topic and you can read through it in just a few minutes, and you come away with some other understanding. And I have to say, I've been reading it over the last few days, and my nightlife has been quite interesting. I would wake up in the middle of the night and automatically start thinking about how many REM cycles I've had, because I just read about that the day before. I haven't read an OBE book for a long time, I have to say. And so, I was triggered into lucid dreaming. I had a couple of lucid dreams these last few nights, which I also don't have that often. So it's really been really interesting. And I feel the practicality of it is partly what's making that, and the accessibility is what's making that kind of have that impact on me.
Yeah, well, that's great to hear. So really, what prompted me to write this latest book, Hacking the Out-of-Body Experience, is that at some point I realized that it had been 20 years since my first book had been published. And I mean, I titled the first book, Out-of-Body Experiences, How to Have Them and What to Expect. And I gave what I thought was quite good techniques, and there's an exercise at the end of every chapter. And I thought it was, pretty decent information on how to induce the experience. But what I found is that on these Facebook groups, I found a lot of people saying, well, I've tried this and I've tried that, and I've tried Monroe, and I've tried Robert Bruce, and I've tried Robert Peterson and all this, and nothing works. And I got to thinking that, maybe my instructions weren't good enough. And there's a whole lot of other information out there about the inducing out-of-body experiences. So my whole goal in this latest book was to make out-of-body experiences more accessible to everyone, and to basically provide enough techniques and tools so that anyone can actually do it. And I try and give scientific basis for all of these techniques and what you're actually trying to accomplish. So what I found on a lot of these OBE books, they have very vague instructions. They say, well, you're trying to do this or whatever, but they don't explain, how it's supposed to work and what you're supposed to be doing. And so a lot of people still are left with questions, and they don't, and especially a lot of these books are, 50 pages long, and they contain 2 pages of technique, and it's not enough. It's a very complex subject. And what I've found is, there are a lot of other books that are out there that give very interesting out-of-body experiences. And for example, one of my favorite, matter of fact, my favorite OBE book of all time is Jürgen Ziewe's Multidimensional Man.
Yes.
He gives all kinds of fabulous stories in that book, narratives in that, but he doesn't have very many techniques. But this book, Hacking the Out-of-Body Experience, I wanted to give advice from all of the experts in the field. So basically, I tried to amass the collected wisdom of all of the authors out there, of all these books that I've read, and say, okay, well, this is what we're trying to accomplish. This is how you do it. And I give the different approaches. So I give a visualization approach and an auditory imagination approach and a tactile imagination approach.
Yeah.
And for each of those approaches, I basically say, okay, well, here's what Robert Bruce says about this subject, and here's what Robert Monroe says about it, and here's what Sylvan Muldoon says about it. And I'm trying to break that down and say, okay, well, here, from a scientific point of view, this is what we're trying to accomplish and why. And this is what the different experts on the topic have said. And so I tried to give as many of those bits and pieces of advice as I could. So I've got, I haven't actually counted, but I know there's more than 50 out-of-body techniques in the book. I go into all kinds of different direct techniques, which is where you lie down and try to induce it from a conscious state. Indirect techniques, where you basically are convincing or cajoling your subconscious into allowing it to happen, and the lucid dreaming, trying to get there from a lucid dream, and then also simple things like diet and exercise, and the different supplements, and
the supplement section was interesting.
Yeah. And so I tried to give a whole, the whole book is geared toward helping you induce out-of-body experiences. And it turned out to be a lot bigger than I had planned. I was kind of surprised when I got my first proof in the mail. It was like 350 pages long. It's like, whoa, I had no idea that it was that big. I mean, looking at my word processor, it's like, okay, just, let's go to this chapter or whatever. But so it's a lot of information out there, but there aren't really any stories in the new book. Well, very few anyway. And there's no history. Well, very little history anyway. But it's all geared toward trying to get people out of body. And the reason I did that is because I am very active in Facebook and all of these astral projection groups, and I see people asking, how do I do this? I'm new to astral projection. Can you guide me how to do it? I'm looking at the question right here on Facebook as we speak. And it's something that people really want to know.
Yes.
And so I'm trying to make the experience more accessible, and not just to, people who are, on a spiritual path, like a shaman or whatever, but also, the common layman and people who are more science oriented, who also want to study the phenomenon.
And I wonder, with that science focus, because the book is definitely has that emphasis, you do this and you do that and something could happen. And if it doesn't happen, well, do this and do that, kind of guiding the person on, always try the other thing.
Yep.
But I had the sense that you kind of reserve judgment, so to speak, about what actually happens in the OBE, whether, and in particular, whether we are leaving the physical body in another body, or whether there's some other process happening. That's one thing I've noticed. And also, I think, I might be wrong, but I didn't really notice many mentions to assistants, helpers, non-physical people that might get involved, and which certainly in my experience were very active in assisting me in having these experiences. I'm curious whether that's partly to do with wanting to keep as much of a scientific line as possible, or whether that reflects, areas where you actually feel, you haven't quite come down one side or the other about what actually happens there.
Well, like I said, I'm pretty much science oriented. I mean, I'm the kind of guy who, if you tell me that something happened, that's outlandish, like an out of body experience. For example, 40 years ago, I would have thought that was very outlandish. But if anyone says, well, this strange thing happened to me, I tend to be very skeptical about those things and science minded. And for example, I've been in many ghost investigations and in haunted places. I try and remain skeptical in all of my interactions. And I even but even as I say that, I've had enough stuff happen to me that I can't deny that there's stuff out there. I've definitely when you're having an out of body experience, it definitely feels very real. It feels like you are in a separate reality, and it feels like you are in a separate body. People describe it as an astral body or whatever, and that's certainly what it feels like. But nobody really knows what consciousness is, and nobody really knows where its source is. But I've done enough studies in that and seen enough stuff that I certainly believe in a non-physical component to it. I tend to not think so much in terms of like a non-physical body or an astral body or a psychosoma or whatever you want to call it from the IAC terms. But I tend to more think in terms of just an experience itself, because I think that we, even when we're in the body, what we're experiencing, I think, is far different from what reality is, because we're always seeing everything through the filter of our consciousness and through the filter of our brains and our minds.
Yes.
And in my experience, yeah, I've had a lot of experiences. I've seen a lot of I've had OBEs in which I've seen spirits and helpers and these non-physical voices, and they're always very helpful. And yeah, a lot of people describe helpers helping them out of body and all of that. But I wanted to keep that mostly out of my book because I wanted to stay grounded in science. And that's I figure if I want to go off on more experiential stuff, and stuff from my own OBEs. I mean, I kind of already did that in the first book.
Yeah.
And I've accumulated, 40 years of experiences, and I'm kind of reserving that for a later book if I decide to do that. I've been working on other books and that, but nothing in the immediate future anyway. But I do enjoy reading the OBE books and the narratives. And matter of fact, I was just reading one the other day where a guy was talking about an OBE in which he finds himself flying in some unknown location. He's flying, in an out-of-body state, and he looks down at his arms, and he can tell that there's another helper there beside him holding onto his hand.
Yes.
And it's like he's being guided and taken somewhere by this non-physical helper. And so he's like, he tries to engage the non-physical helper in conversation. It says, what are you doing here? And, where are we going and all of this? And the non-physical helper basically, snubs him, basically says, well, I'm not here to answer questions. I'm here to take you somewhere. And it's like, okay, that's kind of interesting. And it really kind of matches my experience too, because a lot of times in my OBEs, when I get help from an assistant, a non-physical assistant, I can almost never see them. They're almost always, I call them the invisible helpers, because I can hear them, but I pretty much never see them. And if I do see them, it's more as like an energy, an awareness of their energy. It's not like I'm seeing an astral body. And so I tend to be kind of skeptical when I hear claims about, the ways that different things, people can manifest on the out-of-body state, and that that whole experience from that book I just read of the guy holding hands and all of that and engaging him in conversation, that lended a lot of air of authenticity, because it kind of matches, a lot of what's happened to me too. There are helpers there, but they seem pretty standoffish. They don't want to engage you directly a lot, but they're there to assist. They're there to help you, and if you ask for their help, they're more than happy to help. They'll lend a hand all you want, but you have to actually ask for the help. And so anyway, yeah, I'm kind of babbling there, but that's kind of my take on it.
Yeah, yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense, and I like how you describe that different etiquette in a way of personal interaction. There seems to be uh, the ways that we interact, having little conversations, don't seem to be reciprocated by people on the other side.
Yeah, and a lot of times, my experiences, I'll find myself in some kind of an office or boardroom or whatever, and see people, sitting in chairs and all of this. A lot of times, I seem to be in more physical locations and seeing people doing physical things. Although it's hard to say whether they're actually astral environments, non-physical environments, or if they're someplace, in the physical world, or a facsimile of the physical world on the other side, or what exactly they are. And that almost seems separate from these invisible helpers that I'm talking about. But one thing about my out-of-body experiences is I've spent many, many years just studying the process of leaving the body. And so, when you become a pilot, for example, people, you get in a plane and you do takeoffs and touchdowns. So you take off and land, and you take off and you land, and you take off and land, just to get the process down. And that's a lot of what I've done with my OBEs, is I've studied the process of leaving the body and coming back, and leaving the body and coming back. And my interactions are not nearly as exotic as, say, somebody like Jürgen Siebe in his Multidimensional Man. I've had my fair share of very exotic experiences, and some of which I've shared in the first book. But I've more focused on the actual process of trying to induce them.
And so would you say, so one of the things I was going to ask you is, what do you consider the benefits? Why would a person pursue out-of-body travel? And one of the benefits that people often talk about is that it takes away your fear of death, because you become familiar with what happens, the process of death. This is assuming that what happens at death is like an OBE, we leave the physical body. And when you describe what you just said, that you leave the body and come back and leave the body, I imagine that you would feel very comfortable with that process now. It's a very familiar process. Would you say that's been one of the benefits, and anything else that you feel it's given you in your life?
Yeah, I mean, it's very, I think there are a lot of benefits. For one thing, I firmly believe that all of humankind's beliefs in life after death are the result of someone's out-of-body experience, whether or not it's a near-death experience that happened 2,000 years ago and somebody taught it to somebody else or whatever. But I think all of our beliefs about the after-death state come from OBEs. And I think that it's always better to have direct experience than, first-hand experience always is better than second or third-hand reports. Yes. And as I said earlier, I believe that experience trumps faith, and it trumps belief. And I think that if we can have people who induce their own out-of-body states, and they can see for themselves that we are all just, the same consciousness, for example, there's a lot to be gained from that. For example, maybe we can stop all of the religious bickering and fighting and holy wars and that, fighting about, the Bible says this, the Quran says that, the Bhagavad Gita says this, and, maybe we can agree that this is a universal experience, and we can agree upon what it is and where people go after they die. And if that is the case, think of the kind of world peace that could generate, right? People could
it's massive.
agree. People could. One of my aspirations is that this experience can teach people to grow beyond their limited thinking, and they can become more aware and see each other not as see each other as interconnected. For example, you're out of body. When you're out of body, you realize firsthand that you are just a consciousness, right? You're a soul. You're not a physical body. You don't identify with that physical body. So you tend to think less in terms of I'm hungry, and more in terms of my physical body is hungry. It needs nourishment, whatever, but that's not you. you see you see a person. Let's say you see a black man or an Indian man or some other, a Chinese man, whatever. You don't automatically have those prejudices because you know that you are just a consciousness, they're just a consciousness. And the fact that they're black or white or Hispanic or whatever is just, it's ridiculous. You're as much consciousness as they are consciousness. There's no difference really. And so you learn to see beyond those physical appearances. And even the same physical appearance of female versus male, you tend to see people, you don't see women as objects, you see them as other consciousnesses. So I think that the whole out-of-body thing is very mind-expanding, and there's a lot to be learned from it, a lot to be gained. I think it can teach us where we're going after we die. And I mean, a lot of people, they don't care where they're going after they die. Or if they die, they believe that they're going to heaven or hell or whatever, and they put that thought out of their mind. They completely ignore the thought of what happens when I die until they're faced with that very real, end of life scenario. They have cancer, they're in a hospital bed or whatever, they've got hours to live, and then they get scared because they don't know what's going to happen beyond death. And I think you're right when you said, Kim, that it'll teach us to not fear death, because death is just another transition from one state of conscious awareness to another. And if you leave that physical body behind, that's just, another object in the room, whatever. And it's not this huge tragedy that some people see it as. So I do think there's a lot to be learned and gained from it spiritually. And I think it can take us to spiritual places where faith and belief can't.
Yes. Yeah. No, I mean, those are really big shifts in consciousness, seeing everybody as equal, as an equal consciousness, and knowing that we'll survive death. That would transform the world if that became common consciousness, for sure.
Absolutely.
I want to go back to something practical that goes to what you started off with, and that's the energy that often is experienced in out-of-body states. And one of the posts, I have a blog post about the third eye and feeling. Now, since I started meditating back in the 90s and started becoming interested in this, I've pretty much always felt a pulsation around the third eye chakra. Sometimes more, sometimes less, but it's sort of become a common presence. And the blog post that I wrote about that has received the most comments from anything on my blog, which suggests that it's something that's quite common among people that meditate and that are into these kinds of topics. And I suppose I'm just curious on your take. So certain things that happen is there's pulsation. Sometimes it feels literally like a drill. Sometimes it's when I'm lying down, especially if I'm trying to do an OBE, sometimes I do OBEs and I try and focus on that area of the third eye. It's kind of like seeing it like an exit. And I've had these experiences of these really bright lights that almost always make me open my eyes, because I think someone's come in and turned the light on, and nobody has. It's just happening in my head or on some other level. I'd be curious if you have anything to say about that topic.
Yeah, that all sounds very familiar to me. I remember when I was first getting into this stuff, and my brother Joe, the same brother who gave that Robert Monroe book to my dad, I told him, that I was starting to have these experiences, and I remember he held up his index finger to my third eye area between my eyebrows, and I felt a strange energy pull. And then again, I was I was hooked and curious about that whole thing. And a lot of people think that you induce out-of-body experiences, you exit through one of the chakras. And the most common one would be the third eye chakra. And I do feel the same kind of energy pulsing, and to me, that you described earlier. To me, it feels like there's energy being pulled out of my third eye, and not just the third eye, but also out of the temples and the side of my head. So a lot of times I'll feel energy coming straight out like this from both temples at the same time, and sometimes straight out of the third eye. One of the techniques. There's a couple of authors that are out there. One of them was a French author by the name of Akena. She's sadly passed on, but she was a big teacher in France of out-of-body techniques. And she taught an OBE technique called the fire and the diamond. And basically, and there have been a couple of variants from other authors as well, but basically you focus first on one of your lower chakras, like the dantian, which is below the belly button, just below the belly button, or the root chakra at the base of the spine. And then you alternate from there to the third eye chakra. So you basically are gathering energy down below, and then you're trying to move it up to the third eye.
Okay.
And bouncing it back and forth between what and Akena called it the fire is the root chakra, and the diamond is the third eye chakra. And so that's why she called it the fire and the diamond technique. And you keep alternating between the two, and you kind of build up a momentum between them, and then you project the energy out of your third eye.
So just to be clear, it sounds a little bit like the vibrational states where you move the energy from the top of your head to your feet, which is one thing that the IAC teaches, and which, in fact, I talk people through in the first episode of this podcast. But it sounds like it's a bit like that, but just more localized. So you really focus at the root chakra, and then you consciously move the energy up to your third eye and back down and up and down. Is that did I understand that right?
Yeah, it's very, very similar. Yeah, with the IAC, their Velo technique, basically you're imagining, as I understand it, that you're imagining that you're inside some kind of an energy tube, and you're oscillating the energy up and down all the way down to the base of your feet, all the way up to the top of your head, and back and forth, and you try to create this oscillation. And so it's a very similar concept. Except, with Akena's method with fire and diamond and other ones that are similar, you're doing a very similar thing, and you're kind of trying to bounce the energy up and down and getting that is almost a rocking motion.
Yes.
With the Velo technique, you're trying to induce what they call the vibrational state, which is where you get these out-of-body vibrations sweeping into your body. With fire and diamond, I'm not sure if they really are after that vibration, or if they're more focused on one of my primary techniques that I like to use is where I'm actually trying to build momentum, and so I'm actually trying to get a rocking sensation in my body. I feel like I'm rocking back and forth, and I'm
without actually moving your body, right? You're not actually moving your body. You're trying to move your non-physical body.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to imagine my conscious awareness as being like a liquid inside a bottle, and it's sloshing back and forth and up and down that way. And a lot of times it's longitudinally, like in the Velo technique. But like I said, I tend to gain rather than the vibrations, because like I said, nowadays I don't even notice the vibrations anymore. Well, that's not entirely true. I did notice them the other day, but they were very mild. But on most OBEs, I don't even notice them anymore. And what I do notice is more this rocking sensation back and forth.
Yeah. And have you tried the fire and the diamond technique?
I have tried it, but I haven't actually. I didn't actually have an OBE from that technique.
Okay. Yeah. So I think the last sort of thing I thought we'd touch on today is there's a couple of things. So one is in your second book that I've read, Lessons Out of the Body, you talk a lot about guidance, and you have various chapters where you're following this inner voice. You talk about you're having these dialogues with this inner voice, and it's like you're gaining wisdom from that. So I was curious to hear a bit more about that and how you conceptualize that, and if that's still a part of your life, that inner voice. And the other thing after that, maybe I'm interested to hear a bit more about just the big lessons. You probably touched a bit about, how it impacted your life, but in terms of the fear of death and universalism and so on. But in terms of concepts like karma and purpose of life, whether there's anything like that where out-of-body travel, gave you new insights.
Well, as far as the inner voice is concerned, yes, it's very much a big part of my life, and it's it's okay. There's a lot of complexity there, right? I mean, the new book, Hacking the Out of Body Experience, I talk about an area of the brain called the right TPJ, the right hand temporal parietal junction, and that is basically when you mess with that by one means or another, you can induce out of body states. Because you mess with your sense of proprioception, which is what the body thinks of itself as being spatially oriented and all of that.
Yes.
But it turns out that on the left hand side, the left hand TPJ is in the middle of a language communication area known to scientists as the Wernicke's area, and it has to do with translating mentalese into words. Mm-hmm. And so basically it's one of these translation areas of the brain. And I find it very curious that when I started messing with out-of-body states and doing these meditations, I started getting both OBEs and got in touch with my inner voice. And with my inner voice, what that tells me really is that I was stimulating perhaps both my left TPJ and the right TPJ, and that the inner voice is kind of based on that left TPJ.
Right.
I actually had a lot of people ask me, well, how do I develop inner voice? And it's kind of a subtle thing. It's not nearly a big smack you on the head with a 2x4 thing like out of body states are, but it's a very subtle thing, and it's gotten to the point now where my inner voice is basically kind of automatic for me. I will catch myself conversing with my inner voice and not even realize it. And it's not unless I actually think about, well, what was I just doing? Oh, I was talking to my inner voice. That is obvious to me. So I wrote my fourth book is called Answers Within. And it's basically the story. It's very much like my first book, where it's kind of the story of how I got in touch with my inner voice and where it leads me. And again, because I'm kind of science oriented, I'm kind of a sciencey kind of guy. Inner voice is nothing more than learning to talk to your own subconscious mind. And your subconscious mind, you're always in communication with that regardless. It's just that most people don't pay attention to it because one of the analogies I give is it's like trying to hear a whisper in a rock concert, because
yes,
it's your normal, ordinary, everyday thoughts tend to be very loud, and they drown out everything else that's subtle that's going on. And so when you learn to quiet your mind and learn to pay attention, you can actually get in touch with this other side of you, your subconscious mind. And what I've found is that your subconscious mind has access to all kinds of deep knowledge that you consciously don't have. And I believe that depth goes very far. I think it goes way down the rabbit hole. So you can talk to your inner voice. Your inner voice is basically your subconscious. Your subconscious is in touch with deeper levels where it'll have psychic information. I think pretty much all psychic information just comes from the subconscious. And it's basically what I do in my inner voice is I just translate these thoughts and things that come to me, and I basically kind of narrate them to myself. And it's kind of a strange process to describe, but that's kind of what it is. It's kind of a translation of all these impressions that I'm getting from my subconscious. And I think it's not very different from what a medium does when they claim to be talking to spirits, or what other people do. And I was very surprised to find that there's a book. I can't even remember the name of it now, but it's a book on what happens to the brain during enlightenment experiences.
Oh, yes.
And they basically, one of the things they found is that this getting in touch with your inner voice is kind of a part of that whole deal. And I was kind of surprised to find their connection to that whole deal. So yes, it is still very much a big part of my life right now, but it's not anything that I tend to share with people. And most of what it is it's my own spiritual lessons, things I'm supposed to be learning. You asked about out-of-body experiences and where it's taken me. That second book, well, first of all, the first book was very grounded, and again, sciencey. It's basically reporting what I found in the out-of-body states and how I got there and all of that, the conclusions I could draw from that. And I tried to stay very grounded there. In Lessons Out of the Body, my second book, I tried to be more spiritual and where these OBEs can take you from a spiritual perspective, what you can learn from them. And so I've learned a lot of lessons as far as what I believe personally is that we're all here to experience and to learn and to grow consciously. And I believe that this physical world is basically a kindergarten where people can, it's a playground where people get hurt and they scuff their knees and they cry and they have all these experiences, but they learn and they grow and they learn to relate to one another, and you grow spiritually. So I think that's a good analogy as a playground. I tend to think of this earth as some place that we come to learn lessons. And I think that those lessons are planned well ahead of our lifetime. We come here with an agenda of, okay, I want to know this. I want to learn this task and this task and this task. And we go through and I think that when we have those really hard times, it's because we're not learning what we're supposed to be learning. It's kind of like the fish that's being dashed on the rocks instead of going with the flow. And I think if you go with the flow and you follow where your life plan is supposed to take you according to your higher self, I believe in a higher self. And if you go with that flow and you go according to that plan, your life can be very smooth and easy. And I think part of that is learning as much as you can and being honest with yourself and helping others along the way. One of the biggest life lessons that I ever learned is expectations, because what I found is when I expected people to behave a certain way. I expected people to, do this when I wanted that, and I expected this and I expected that, and especially in interpersonal relationships, girlfriends and wives and husbands and all of that. You expect them to do a certain thing and they don't do it, and you get all upset or whatever. But expectations are really an enormous life lesson of mine, and to learn to not have expectations. I think expectations are a big hurdle that we need to all get through, and judgment. Anyway, there's a lot of spiritual things that can be gained, and are my OBEs responsible for that? I don't know. It's hard to say. My inner voice, I think that's been a big part of that, because my inner voice does give me it'll give me a side commentary on things, as I'm doing them, for example, which sounds kind of weird, but it's like, it's, you're supposed to be doing something, or you're fighting against something or whatever. And anyway, that's kind of my nickel tour.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. And just before we finish up, just wanting to clarify, out of that inner voice and higher self, are they the same thing?
No, like I said, I think inner voice is your subconscious. That's learning to talk to your subconscious. But I think your subconscious has direct access to your higher self. And I think there are several layers of higher self that go up and up and up until we all are connected to one another as the highest self, which a lot of people would tend to call God or the source. So I tend to think that we're all interconnected at some point. And so that I do think we're directly connected, but my inner voice is what I call talking to my subconscious, and my subconscious is talking to my higher self. And I've had experiences in which it seems like I've been the watcher, or that, a different level above this level of consciousness or whatever. So I know that we have multiple layers of conscious awareness. Yes. And so anyway, it's a very complex topic.
Yeah, it is a complex topic, but it's a great topic, and maybe one we can pick up on another occasion. Today we've got to wrap it up, but it was really lovely to have you, Bob. And like I said, it would be great to get you back on further down the track.
Yeah, great. I'm glad you had me on, Kim. I really appreciate it. And if anybody wants access to the blog or the book reviews. They're on there's a link on my website, which is robertpeterson.org.
Yep, and there'll be links to all of Bob's material on the website for this podcast, and all the information will follow at the end of this. All right. Thanks so much, Bob.
Thanks, Cam.
I really hope you got some value out of today's episode. If you did, why not leave a positive review on iTunes and share it with your friends to help others find it. The tune seeing us out is Axel Teslev's Akasha. Axel is a Finnish virtuoso who creates some awesome fusion music that is well worth checking out. You can find more information about today's guest, including any links to their work, on my website, multidimensionalevolution.com. While you are there, check out my blog and my book, which you can purchase from any good bookstore if you want to show your love for the show. Finally, please get in touch. Whether you want to ask questions or simply share your experiences, I always love exchanging information, and that is what this is all about for me. Otherwise, you'll catch me when you tune in again. Until then, I'm sending you my very best energies.